Okay, here we go. 4 views on the image of God in 10 minutes. What is the image of God? Well, it comes from Genesis 1:26 and 27. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created. All right, so we want to look at what the image of God specifically means in this passage. Some of the explanations interface with the idea of after our likeness, but let's get into this. We're going to look at probably what are the top 4 scholarly opinions on the image of God. The first is what has come to be called the substantive view, and it refers to the inner quality of a person. All right, so the basic idea is that the image of God is what humans are. It is our rational, moral, self-aware inner person. Okay? So it's like a focus on the mind, on the soul, and our moral capacity as a reflection of who God is. Now you can see this being really popular in Protestant Christianity, where through the years we've placed so much emphasis on the morality of a redeemed Christian, the redeemed follower of Christ, and following God morally. And so, not that we shouldn't. I'm not criticizing any of these views, but you can see how this one has risen as like a really prominent view, because we are to therefore reflect the goodness of God, the moral character of God. God is a perfectly moral being, and therefore we reflect his perfect morality. And especially as we're talking about Adam and Eve being created in the beginning, in being placed in the garden before sin entered the world, you can see that if this is what the image of God means, that they in every way, at least in that moment that they were created, perfectly reflected God's image, or perfectly bore God's image, you could say. And so there is some weaknesses to this view, though. It's hard to define if it's tied to things that are like abilities or characteristics natural to all humankind. Here's what I mean. If you have young children, or especially like an infant, or perhaps better analogy would be a toddler, or somebody with mental disabilities, severe mental disabilities, that perhaps does things that are immoral and aren't so much doing them willfully in defiance or, rebellion against God, then you can look at that person and say, well, maybe they are created. That person is created in the image of God because they can't seem to reflect his morality. And so that's the weakness of this view, the substantive view. Lots of theologians have ways of working around that and discussing that. So I'm not saying that that makes it wrong. All right. So the substantive view, the inner quality. The second is the physical view. And this one literally the opposite of the former. And it's the idea that we bodily image God, that we have a bodily resemblance to God. So you might not realize it's a common view. It's not so much a common view against scholars today, but it is a historically common view. And the basic idea is that what human beings look like bears visible resemblance to what God himself looks like. You've maybe never heard that before, but it takes this idea of image in a very literal, fundamental sense. And so today, like I said, this is rare, but it has some good representation throughout history. And oddly, it has good representation at most groups that we would call Christian cults. And so you can see it working into like Jesus only type of circles where there's some kind of physical resemblance. They're seeing Jesus as God, very God, and the Father as merely an analogy, and the Spirit as the Spirit of Jesus. And so in some of these type of cultic circles, you can see how this might play out. Image of God, therefore, means what God looks like. And we as human beings, as Christ's creation, we look like we look like Jesus. So that's the physical view. Now, obvious weakness to that is that it tends to be adopted by, Unitarian groups, and where you don't have the Trinity, you don't have Father, Son, and Spirit. You don't have a God who transcends creation coming to be immanent and active within creation. And so we run into a lot of theological issues if we are to take that view. Okay, so the physical view. The third is what I would call the functional view. This idea that humankind is a representative ruler of God. So the idea is that the image of God is what humans are supposed to do with the creation, which if you go back to the reading of Genesis 1:26 and 27, it's to have dominion over the earth. And that dominion is interpreted by most scholars as meaning creation care. Like that's what Adam and Eve were supposed to do in the garden. They were supposed to care for the garden. They were supposed to multiply within the garden. And as humankind multiplied within the garden, they were then supposed to spread the goodness of the garden over all the earth, multiply and fill the earth. And so this idea is that God is the creator, and he created this microcosm of paradise that is Eden. And then he commissioned man in his image to go and to spread that forth to all the earth. Very strong contextual view. It fits the immediate context. It talks about Adam's rule. He's both the priest and the king of the garden, and he's supposed to multiply, fill the earth. Okay. So that's really the strength of it. You can just totally see this view right in context. There is a weakness to it. The weakness of this view, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily exclude the others, but if you're trying to say like there's one view, the image of God just means this one thing, and you adopt this view, you might start to downplay the differences between God and man in a moral sense. So that now when we see Jesus do certain things, let's say in the Gospels, that you might say, well, that was for Jesus to do, and perhaps even for the apostles, but not something that is supposed to be reflected in all of humankind. So, if, for example, you see Jesus making a statement or activities about making peace, you could then say, oh, but, we have war because of this, that, or the other reason. And I'm not saying making a statement about just war or anything like that. I'm just simply saying that's an area that this plays into. And so now you don't have to look like God morally, per se, in every sense, because you can create a division where some things might be moral for God, but immoral for humankind. And to me, that creates a philosophical issue. So I see this as weakness to sort of this functional view. But I do think it has very strong contextual representation. All right, so that's 3. Here's the 4th view. The 4th view is the relational view. And it says that to be in the image of God is to have a capacity for relationship. And what the relational view is doing is it's working with the context, but a little bit larger narrative context of sort of Genesis 1 through Genesis 3, where we're reflecting on the created design for Adam and Eve to have communion in the garden with God himself. And so it's saying that like we have the capacity for relationship with one another and with God in a way that, let's say, the animals, and certainly the plants, do not have with each other. That the capacity for relationship that a human has is different from even what your dog or your cat has. And I think everybody would basically agree that that's true, even if they wouldn't agree that that's what the image of God means. But there is a very strong contextual argument, if you look at the narrative of chapters 1 through 3, where you see sort of temple imagery all throughout, and you see God coming and he meets with Adam and Eve in the garden. You get the sense that, like, they go to the center of the garden, and that's where the tree of life is, and they commune with God and they receive life from the tree. And sort of that tree imagery becomes imagery of Christ. And so you have this relational view that has to do with, well, I mean, frankly, what we celebrate in the Lord's Supper, that it's communion with God and it's communion with each other before God. And so the strength is really that it connects the image of knowing God to relationship, so that it's not just knowing about God that we're required to do, but it's actually to have a relational connection to him. It's a sacramental expression, you could say, within this relational view. And so, but there is weakness to it. The weakness is that essentially it doesn't properly engage the context of Genesis 1. Like, you really don't get that until you get into chapters 2 and 3. And so the relational view, you could say, doesn't have strong representation within its immediate context in Genesis 1. And so a lot of people will argue for other views. If they're arguing context, they're going to say no, immediate context demands the functional view. And then really you don't get into relational context until later on. I do want to say this about it. We've got 20 seconds left. As we wrap up here, notice that these views don't in every way conflict with each other. So a lot of times we do this where we want to say, that's right, that's wrong, this is my view. Okay, so some things to think about, to pray about, to study. As always, Christ is king, and that changes everything. God bless.